Now, I'm going to talk about technology today, so fasten your seatbelt because I'm going to go pretty fast. But I was most recently in my travels in Shenzhen. And Shenzhen, for those of you who don't know, is the hardware capital of the world. It's where all your iPhones and Samsung devices and your Xiaomi products or whatever are all made. And the overflow of those factories ends up places like this. This is a video that I took, which you're not supposed to take, hence it's a very sort of covert operation that I'm doing, in one of the hardware markets. And that's where all the overflow ends up. That's where all the spare parts that go out the back door of the factory instead of the front door onto the supply chains. And people start experimenting with the kind of stuff that's available in these kind of like department stores full of spare parts. And what's really interesting is outside these factories are huge billboards advertising exactly what's going on inside. You can buy a Sony PSP that someone's made for you, or you can buy a bit of camera cable or an LCD screen, or even some military technology if that's something you want to play with in your spare time. And it's not just hardware that's available in places like this, the software is also there too. The intellectual property that many companies around the world have spent years in R&D developing is all available there for anyone to look at and take and use as a recipe whatever device they want to make. So the blueprint for the Apple iPhone was there, I took a look at it. It was actually annotated in Chinese characters for those people who couldn't actually read the English. But the idea, of course, is that when you have this very creative, slightly off-the-radar community, you could get some pretty interesting creativity going on. In some countries, of course, we call this theft. In Shenzhen, it translates to a more kind of sharing sort of word. But what I'm interested in, even though this might seem like a completely unrelated thing to your lives or your businesses, is these are the kind of places where the next game-changing technologies are going to emerge. William Gibson said that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. But I think it's heavily skewed to places like Shenzhen, very hungry places on the early stops, of course, of the Silk Route, that I think are very interesting to watch. And then when I was there, I heard time and time again that companies in the West, or industries as a whole, spend too much time protecting their IP and not enough time developing it. So I want to explore a little bit today examples like that of Shenzhen that are changing incredibly fast without much concern for established businesses. And so I want to explore that a little bit. But why was I in Shenzhen? Well, I'm on this year-long research adventure that I've created for myself, where I'm spending a bit of time hunting for surprises, talking to some weirdos and troublemakers, some scientists and hackers, to see what are those connections between technologies, between ideas, between industries. And I'm going to try and share some of that with you today. Because I've learned that we're no longer just connected. We're in fact entangled, not just with each other, but with the machines, and it's becoming impossible to opt out. So I want to explore that a little bit, and explore how it's impossible now to stick to the old rules of how we got to where we are today, and we're going to have to explore an entirely new way of doing business. So I want to talk from a mindful perspective about, I think that the technologies that are coming, that I'll talk to you about now, can bring some truth back and some trust into our post-truth world. And I'm going to start the three technologies I'm going to talk about with talking about the fact that I believe we're turning the world into a computer. What I mean by that is that each of our houses, our cars, or the satellites that will be watching us that I'll talk about in a minute, are processing information about us constantly. And I want to explore what that might mean. As promised, I'll start talking about satellites. They're a big passion of mine. We now have the ability to read the planet from space. We have a whole constellation up there, these little satellites that you can see popping out of either side of the space station there. They're very small. They're only about the size of a shoebox. But essentially, they can give us real-time CCTV of the planet. And that's pretty extraordinary. And that's companies like Planet, for example, called Planet Labs. And they're developing satellites like this. This is called a Dove. And what it does, and this is completely amazing to me, it sends these tiny little shoeboxes up 380 miles above us here. These things go at 17,000 miles an hour, which is pretty remarkable, and they give us 30 centimeter resolution of the planet. Now, what do I mean by that? 30 centimeters is about the size of a laptop. That means I can see a laptop from space. My head is not that much smaller than a laptop, so I'm thinking in the next year or so, we're going to be able to see faces from space. I think that's pretty amazing, and if I had more time, I would pause to celebrate science, but I don't today, so I'm going to carry on. But people are going to sell this information, as they are already, to hedge funds, to the oil industry, to human rights groups, to tech companies, because they then have this incredible resolution of what's going on the planet. And why shouldn't luxury companies take advantage of this almost live CCTV that we're streaming? And the question becomes then, what story do you want to tell about the world? What do you want to know? Because the answers are all there. Perhaps you want to know how many people are at a certain event, or an event that your competitor's doing, or who's shopping at your stores, maybe yesterday, today, all of last year, whatever. This is a company called Orbital Insight that maps car parks in retail stores across the US. They track 250,000 parking lots, and they can extrapolate, oh, JCPenney is going to have to close some of their stores in the next quarter because people have been stopping driving to JCPenney recently, and of course they have just closed 138 stores. Satellites are being used to help with mapping. This is Nigeria. It's not particularly well mapped, so they can actually just do that from space now. Perhaps you're interested in geopolitics. You can check out what's going on in the South China Sea. Maybe you're in the car industry. You're probably pretty curious, if you are, what Tesla is doing. This is the Gigafactory that Elon Musk opened in Nevada. He very kindly put it in the Nevada desert. There's no cloud cover in the Nevada desert, so it's pretty easy to watch from space. So if you're in the car business and you want to know how much raw materials is going in one end and how many cars or batteries are coming out of the other, you can pretty much do that now. My major insight, though, about this satellite business is the fact that Uber is going to start using these satellite images now to actually tell where they're going to pick up people. So basically that means that these images have become so cheap that you can literally use them on a person or passenger-by-passenger basis. And that's a huge insight as far as I'm concerned, because I believe we're building a time machine. We're going to be able to scrub back in time to see what led to that bankruptcy, what led to that landslide. How can we think about whatever daily variation of the planet that is super interesting? And of course, the time machine may be able to answer the biggest question of our time. How many people were at the inauguration? But at some point, we're also going to be able to tell who was at the inauguration, because what is a face but a collection of pixels? And not just who was at the inauguration, but how they're feeling. But I'll talk a bit more about that later. But in our post-truth world, I think trust is going to be at a premium. And I think we can leverage some of these innovations to corroborate facts that we are given, whether those are alternative facts or not. It isn't just satellites. I'm particularly interested in autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles will stream live 360 video of every city they're driving around. I don't think people are thinking about autonomous vehicles as a data center, but they will be. Drones, they can already monitor your face if you're their owner. They can follow you around doing facial recognition. I'm pretty sure that most emotion recognition, this is a company I saw when I was out in China, is going to be huge, and I'll talk about that a bit later on. And of course, we're all willingly handing over everything that's happening inside our houses by telling our Alexa or our Amazon Echo all of our wildest dreams. As I said, I believe the world is becoming a computer. Your house is a computer, your stores are a computer, your hotel might be a computer, your cars will become a computer. These are computers that will process information about us and that you can search for information. Now, what does this mean? I think that it means that our behavior will all be categorized all the time. Where we shop, where we live, where we stay, how we breathe, everything will be observed and categorized by AI. So the question becomes, what would you do if you had all the data in the world? What would you do if you had all the retail data in the world? What would you do if you had all the tourism information in the world? Because basically that's what's going to happen. Information or answers become cheap. Questions are what becomes valuable. And Picasso, I don't often quote Picasso, but I saw that he said, not recently, in the 60s, computers are useless, they can only give you answers. And that is exactly the kind of dilemma we are in today. We are swimming in data and we don't have the right questions. Of course, ethically, I'm sure you're all absolutely horrified at everything I've just said, and it's about to get worse. And you may feel conflicted, of course, personally and professionally about how this might personally be quite intrusive, but professionally quite useful. Cory Doctorow, who I met in Los Angeles quite recently, talked about the fact that we might be being Huxleyed into the full Orwell. So I'll leave you to think about what that might mean. But essentially, in an environment that's being mediated by technology, the boundary between us and a company or us and a government is getting pretty blurry. And as always, technology is miles ahead of regulation. There will be, as with everything else, a law lag to catch up with the kind of technologies. So it's a bit of a wild west out there, or at least up there at the moment. But cultures, funnily enough, have always prioritized wealth and convenience over privacy. Instagram is a perfect example of that, I think. And you may, I think about a lot of this stuff as being a bit scary. I certainly do. But I'm also a huge optimist about what this technology can do and its potential for good. So I want to talk now about the sort of next technology area, because if the real world is becoming a computer that we can search, then what's going to be happening to the online universe? So I want to explore that a little bit now. I recently spent a few days on the Warner Brothers lot in Hollywood with DreamWorks and Warner Brothers and Lucasfilm talking about so-called artificial realities. What might happen to humanity once true, i.e. where we are today, and artificial realities start to blend seamlessly? Because there's little doubt, I think, that the internet is going screenless. Content is moving out of our devices and into our field of vision, and that's going to change a lot of stuff. This is a completely horrifying video from a guy called Matsuda, and it's called Hyperreality. I really recommend you all go and watch it. And it's basically the dystopian possible future we may be going into if we're not very careful. We don't know how augmenting our environment is going to play out. This is just provocative art. But I think he draws on some really interesting questions about how comfortable we are with having virtual objects controlling how we understand the world. Because I think that is what's going to happen. In the next 5 to 10 years, we will use virtual objects, virtual experiences, to interact with brands to make major purchasing decisions. I think that's almost inevitable. And I believe that these virtual objects like this will control the way we see and understand the world, whether we're wearing a headset or not. So what do I mean by all of this? Well, we're becoming increasingly comfortable with simulations. We used to navigate our way around places with a map. Now, I think this is a natural evolution, this is Google's Tango, of where we might be going. You guys might have seen a lot of these platforms where you can superimpose furniture and things like that into your house. Apple's iPhone 8, when it comes out later this year, will have this kind of technology built into it. So any of you who are iPhone users, you will all be using this kind of technology in the next few years, or even in the next few months. Google, Microsoft, everyone is talking about having this as just a normal app within your phone. So where next? What happens after small simulations like this just dotted on our real world? Well, to your point about experience, Susie, I think we're going to end up in rich and more complex simulations in a virtual environment. And I'm going to have to ask you now to use your imagination a little bit, because I'm going to give you some examples from computer games. I don't play computer games myself, but I watch the gaming industry very closely because I think it gives us a glimpse as to what's coming from a virtual and sort of avatar experience. So this is a game called EVE Online. It's a kind of alien shoot-'em-up situation where you just go around and blow up lots of flying spaceships. This is a very rich and technically complex environment that you can just go and live in if you want to, which I think is completely extraordinary. You may or have kids even that play Grand Theft Auto. Grand Theft Auto is an incredible version of Los Angeles, essentially. So incredible, in fact, that the algorithms that are going to be driving our self-driving cars are actually training on this landscape, training on a virtual landscape before they're going to train on the real world, which is kind of extraordinary. But imagine this as a superstore. Imagine this as a cinematic experience. Imagine this as some amazing new experience that we can all try. I'm pretty excited about that because this is a really big deal. We're talking about putting objects, whether that's a beating heart if you're a medical student, or indeed actual people. We might be beaming people into our lives. This is a massive leap on from the internet today. This is not an incremental step of something we've got already. This is a completely quantum leap beyond anything we've got. And it's a huge social experiment. We have no idea how culture, how social conventions, how commerce will evolve if reality becomes something we can just check out of, or if there are indeed many realities that we can choose from. So before you think, oh, well, this is not really for my business, it's all very nice and there's computer games and things, but it's not really for me, I kind of feel like the train's already left the station. If you look at this amazing lab that I went to recently in Los Angeles called SciFutures, they made an incredible app using very photoreal products to see what it was like to do market research in virtual reality. So you can pick up the products, the definition is so high you can read the ingredients on the back of them, and they did say to me the future of market research is in the virtual space. People move around the store in the same way that they move around a regular store. So if the next generation of these digital or internet experiences becomes virtual, what does it mean for you guys? Well, just as many people were underprepared or skeptical about the internet or skeptical about e-commerce, some of course arguably still are, it's an amazing new leap that we're taking that I think if you're not paying attention or you're not open at least to some ideas, the access to these new markets, this is from Alibaba, are going to be limited to you. And I think that's something we can learn from the first iteration of the internet, that perhaps we shouldn't miss that bus. Because the direction of travel for me seems incredibly clear. And soon there'll be a transactional experience within here, so you don't have to leave that virtual world in order to make a payment. because there are huge online economies already. I don't know, again, if any of your children play World of Warcraft, but that's one of the biggest 100 big economies in the world. It's an extraordinary amount of money that is transacted. And I like watching them, as I said, because I feel like it gives you this really close insight, again, this is Alibaba, into what the future of commerce might look like. And I'm interested in the emotional side of it too. So whilst today we watch movies, increasingly movies are watching us. I want to talk about emotion and technology now, because I think that these technologies, as I'm sure you've all seen already, are able to map and react to our emotional state in response to content that we're viewing. This is a company called MTech. These screenless worlds that I believe we're moving into, and the content is on the world rather than on our screen, will be hands-free. Clearly, we're not going to be typing instructions into something while we're looking at a virtual world. So they're going to understand our intentions by looking at our facial muscles, at our stress responses, at our heart rate, at where our eyes are moving. And they'll be doing that probably 1,000 or more times per second. I believe that our emotions will become our keyboard. And we will type with our eyes, we'll type with our heart rate, we'll type with our muscle impulses. And given that we know, and you guys know more than ever, that brand and purchase decisions are emotional, I'm imagining that if we're moving into a world where we track emotions all the time, that's going to be a huge bonus for anyone who's in commerce. But of course, that can be manipulated. So back to the hyper-reality video, it could end up in this horribly dystopic moment where our emotions are manipulated in order to make us buy things. So I think that websites or worlds like this are going to dynamically change as we look at them. And virtual and emotion tracking will be heavily used across everywhere, in real life and also in these virtual spaces. So as we look confused or bored, the content will perhaps change to make us feel happier. Or movies, as I talked about in Hollywood, are going to change. The endings will change depending on how your emotional response has been. And if you, again, don't think this is really a thing, Google's just bought this company called iFluence. It's an eye tracking technology. Facebook just bought one called iTribe. I think we're at the beginning of bringing emotions to the internet, emotions to virtual worlds. What we say, what we do, how we feel, and how we look in virtual universes will all be tracked. So I think that virtual reality companies are going to be the biggest data companies in the future, because they'll know everything there is to know about us and every private thought or muscle movement that we've ever had. And I think they're probably going to sell that data in the same way that Google and Facebook and others sell our data today. But the emotions in VR are real, and this is a really important insight. Each of the environments that you might be hanging out in this virtual environment, of course, fake. But the emotions that we have in them are real. And this was a huge breakthrough. No one knew this was going to happen. And the best example of, I think, of this is in the medical sphere. So this is Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles. And they use virtual experiences almost like a pharmacy. They prescribe a relaxing experience for someone who's about to go into the operating theater. They prescribe a cold environment for someone who's a burns victim. There's a VR pharmacy that they can use. I think that's absolutely extraordinary. And as I said, they kind of hijack our brains, these virtual experiences. This is a very famous British snooker player. He is a professional snooker player, and yet he is so confused by the fact that he is playing in a virtual environment that he actually thinks he can lean on the table. Now, the graphics in this are actually not very good, and yet still his mind was tricked into thinking that is what was happening. It's a very powerful set of technologies. And the avatars that we will have in these experiences are getting better and better. They look like us, they sound like us, and indeed they will be us when we got enough bandwidth in our cars. Our autonomous vehicles will just video us in 360, and we'll just teleport us to our friend's house to have a chat on the way to work. So today, we attach more importance to the real world. But the boundaries are blurring pretty fast, and I think materiality is actually going to become less important, which is beautifully chiming with Susie's thesis on the fact that perhaps luxury is becoming more immaterial as well. So we're moving into this world wide web of worlds, a screenless new economy where our perceptions can be heightened, our emotions can be heightened or manipulated, and many people think that these artificial realities that we have are going to be just as significant or meaningful to us as the real world is today. Or perhaps our virtual reality home movies will be some of our most treasured possessions. And it's a fascinating time to be at the forefront of all of this, and you guys are really watching the earliest days of the future of the internet. But of course, it's important to ask very huge questions, I would argue, about how okay we are with a lot of these technologies. How can trust be embedded into some of these quite invasive systems. And I'm afraid I don't have many answers to that. Opting out is incredibly hard. I've really only got a few options, so I'm going to give them to you now. One is that you can wear a t-shirt with other people's faces on it. And that confuses the cameras into thinking that you are more than one person. It's not very practical, I agree. It's a project called Real Face Glamourphage. There's another one that involves doing crazy things with your hair and makeup. Again, I don't think this is a very practical thing to do, but what I like about these artists who are experimenting, this is CV Dazzle, experimenting with this, is that they're forcing us to confront some of the very real challenges we're going to have as we just sleepwalk into a lot of these big technology areas. I heard the other day someone talking about the fact we might start using Botox a lot more in order to fox the emotion recognition cameras who are trying to predict what we're going to buy. So go long on Botox companies. You heard it here first. So I'm going to finish on synthetic intelligence, on artificial intelligence, because of course your data is only as good as the intelligence you've got to throw at it. So I think that we're going to transfer our authority to artificial intelligence. We kind of already do it. For those of you who flew here in a plane, I'm sorry to break it to you, but it wasn't really the pilot that flew the plane. It was mostly, I think it was about 7 minutes of that is driven by a human. And as we move into these virtual worlds, that's going to get more and more intense. And also, artificial intelligence isn't the future. Facebook uses it every day to predict what's in an image. Google's been using it for years to give you better search results. Amazon, of course, uses it in its Alexa platform, in your Echo at home, which, by the way, makes the choice on any of the consumer decisions that you make. So Amazon is essentially becoming, of course, that pipe to the world, which is exactly what Jeff Bezos wants. But firstly, and briefly, in my dying moments, I want to think about what AI is. If nothing else, you can impress your friends with knowing a little bit more than them. Essentially, it isn't just about teaching machines to do things that we do. That's just called automation. We know how to do that. We've been doing that for centuries. What I'm talking about is letting the artificial intelligence do things that we can't do or can't do very well, like driving. We don't have an algorithm for some tasks. I don't know how my brain recognizes Susie's face. That is something, facial recognition is something that we actually don't know how we do as a process. And yet, we have taught machines, usually by practicing on computer games, to learn how to do that themselves. We have taught the machines to learn how to recognize faces. It's called deep learning. And it scales very, very quickly. Unlike us, computers get better at getting better at learning things, which is why they become very smart very quickly. I always encourage people to think about artificial intelligence, as a commodity, like electricity or Wi-Fi. You don't keep those in a separate department in your company. You use them to electrify your entire business. You don't separate that out. I think leaving AI to your kind of R&D teams or your tech teams would be a bit like having the internet today and only letting the IT team use it. Because I think every country actually, but every company needs a legitimate AI strategy. Because it's hard to think of any problems that superintelligence couldn't solve for us. And to be honest, we've created some pretty sticky problems that we're probably not going to be able to fix in time unless we can throw some superintelligence at them. Cars, as I mentioned, are going to be driven by algorithms. I always use the example that when I was working out in Silicon Valley, people would try and swerve into the autonomous vehicles practicing on the 101 just to see what they should do. Now, that is why humans should not be on the road, is that they gamble with their life just to see what a robot would do on a motorway at 70 miles an hour. Hospitals, of course, are able to use this sort of thing for rapid diagnostics. A company called Sentient uses AI to be able to read your vital signs every 125 milliseconds. They've driven down the incidence of sepsis in Mass Gen Hospital by 96%, and it's a huge killer. I'm sure you guys aren't terribly worried about this, but we're using artificial intelligence to spot asteroids, so that'll stop a kind of extinction type event using some superintelligence. But more perhaps familiar to you would be the kind of e-commerce distribution centers that use artificial intelligence for their robots to speak to each other as they're getting us our luxury items. Google uses it to drive down the energy levels in their data centers, and even, unbelievably, the AIs have learnt to bluff whilst playing poker. So there's an incredible kind of question that we might have about how comfortable we are with a lot of these very powerful and very smart technologies. So to finish, There are many challenges with a lot of these technologies, and particularly with AI. AI is biased often with the principles or the ethics of the person who's programming it, but also, of course, jobs. It's one of the biggest questions of our time is what are we going to do in the future? Now, I think that's an important question, but I think there's a bigger question that we need to ask, and that is that these technologies are huge existential challenges to us as a species. I love the quote from Peter Thiel when he said, "If aliens landed on the planet tomorrow, your first question would not be, I wonder if this alien is going to take my job. Your first question would be, is it going to kill me? Is this something that I really need to worry about on a deep philosophical level?" I think it's bigger than just jobs. It could be the last invention that we ever make, which doesn't sound very mindful, so I think we need to watch that one as well. But I think we deserve a better dialogue about the kind of technologies that I'm lucky enough to see every day. Because as Elon Musk says, we're kind of already cyborgs. We already use our brains to outsource to our mobile phones. We're already tied to our laptops and our devices, and I think that's only going to get deeper, and as I said earlier, more entangled. But I want us to ask bigger and better questions about technology, be more mindful about what we're moving into, and not sleepwalk into an undesirable future, but be much more responsible about how we use these great powers that are now at our fingertips. Thank you very much.